If you've been paying attention to the news lately, then you've been hearing a lot about UFOs, or UAPs as the current term goes. But in the vast majority of these incidents, the unidentified objects many people have reported seeing have been at a distance. At the time of this recording, there is currently a wave of mysterious drone sightings over New Jersey going on. Drones that are almost certainly some U.S. military operation. But that's a story for another day. In the history of people seeing unidentified flying objects, it's unusual to hear a story about not only a very close encounter with a mysterious flying object, but how about a case with numerous credible witnesses inside the United States military, one of whom claims to have actually touched the craft. About 130 kilometers northeast of London, nestled in the heart of the English countryside, is the quaint little English town of Woodbridge. Just outside the town, you can find two Royal Air Force bases called RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge. The bases were both decommissioned back in 1993. But during the 1980s, both bases were very much active, and they were both on permanent loan to the United States Air Force. Situated between the two bases was Rendlesham Forest, and it was there, in the early morning hours of December 26, 1980, that a strange event occurred that many people believe to be one of the most well-reported and well-documented UFO encounters in history. An encounter that many people refer to as Britain's Roswell. It all started in the early morning hours after Christmas 1980. Because of the holiday, the base was mostly quiet, but remember, this was also the middle of the Cold War, so base security always had to be vigilant. That night, one of the security officers on patrol was Airman First Class John Burroughs. What happened to him that night would change his life forever. At around 3 a.m., Burroughs was out on patrol near Woodbridge's East Gate when he spotted an object emitting a series of flashing lights, descending from the sky over Rendlesham Forest. These lights appeared to be stacked on top of one another, and they kept alternating between red and blue flashes. Burroughs informed his supervisor, Staff Sergeant Bud Steffens, and soon the two men were both standing there staring in amazement as the lights moved around. By that point in his career, Burroughs had been stationed at the base for 17 months. He had never seen anything like these lights before. At first, Burroughs and Steffens thought there might have been some sort of aircraft that crashed in the woods. Probably not a military aircraft, but maybe some small civilian plane. So Burroughs and Steffens unlocked the east gate and drove down a small public road before reaching a turnoff into the forest. By this point, they could see a white light as well. Even stranger still, this light appeared to be moving closer toward them. Burroughs and Steffens thought they knew every sort of aircraft there was, but these lights were unlike anything they were familiar with. By this point, Burroughs and Steffens decided they needed some backup. So they drove back to the east gate and radioed in for assistance. Pretty soon the security supervisor, Jim Peniston, showed up. John described to Peniston what he and Bud saw out in the woods. Jim came to the same conclusion that they did, that there must be a crashed plane out there somewhere. But when Steffens first radioed into headquarters to alert them that there may be an unknown aircraft in the woods, he raised a few alarm bells, because he told them in no uncertain terms, whatever this thing was, it didn't crash. It landed. Before the men drove back out into the woods, they decided to make another call into air traffic control to see if they had picked up anything on radar. And it turns out, they did. Air traffic control told the men that they saw a bogey. That's the term for an aircraft of unknown origin. The security officers had no choice but to drive back out into the woods to investigate. They were joined by another officer, Airman Edward Cabansag, and the four of them hopped back in the Jeep and drove out along the access road to where John and Bud had originally seen the lights. But from there, things grew even stranger. The men got out of the Jeep and walked into the woods, but as they got further away from the Jeep, their radios began experiencing some strange interference. They quickly realized that all four of their radios were still able to work at a short distance, but they were unable to radio back to base. The best they could do was use the radios to remain in contact with one another. So they decided to arrange themselves in a sort of relay system. Airman Cabansag went back to the Jeep. Bud Steffens remained about halfway into the forest, keeping within range. Then Jim and John kept heading toward the lights. As the two men continued into the woods, they began to notice that the air around them felt strange. They described the air around them as feeling thick and heavy, and it buzzed with static electricity. The hair on the back of their necks and on their arms was standing up. As the men drew closer to the object, they also began to experience the strange sensation that it was getting more difficult to walk. It almost felt as if they were wading through deep water. The men could see the lights directly in front of them, but it was getting harder and harder to get to it. Then all of a sudden, there was a gigantic burst of light so powerful it knocked the men off their feet. It took a moment for Jim to regain his senses and realized what had just happened. He looked around for John, and he realized that John was standing there frozen. That's because of what he was looking at. Right in front of him was a small triangular craft, unlike anything either of them had ever seen before. The object was about 3 meters high and about 3 meters across at the base. The craft's shell looked less like metal and more like opaque black glass. It stood on 3 legs, and it had blue light shining down from the bottom, and another bright white light on top. Jim couldn't help himself. He felt compelled to step closer toward the object. Jim couldn't see any rivets or seams along the craft's sleek exterior, nor could he see any sort of crew compartment or even any exhaust. One thing he did notice was a series of cryptic symbols that were written along the exterior of the craft. They looked to him almost like Egyptian hieroglyphics. Jim knew that no one would ever believe him later on, so he knew he had to document this. He took out his notebook and sketched the craft, along with those weird hieroglyphics. Then he did something else that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. He reached out and touched it. He said the craft was warm and smooth to the touch, but almost immediately as he ran his fingers along the strange symbols, another blinding white light shot up out of the top of the vessel. It was in that moment that Jim Penniston began seeing this series of ones and zeros rushing through his head. He didn't know what these numbers were or why he could see them in his mind clear as day. The next thing he knew, the aircraft lifted off the ground and shot away into the night. Jim and John just stood there in shock. The 2 men didn't know exactly what they had just encountered, but one thing they knew for certain, whatever that thing was, it wasn't from Earth. They knew they weren't hallucinating. All around them, they could see broken tree branches, where the craft had come down and shot back up to the trees. There were also 3 deep indentations in the dirt where the craft was perched just moments before. Later on, they would come to learn there were several other witnesses who would corroborate seeing strange lights in the sky that week. When Jim and John returned to the Jeep, there was a group of perplexed-looking airmen standing around there waiting for them. One of them radioed into Woodbridge that they could call off the search party. Burroughs and Penniston were both safe and alive. But safe and alive? Jim and John didn't understand what was happening. That's when they got another shock after they were informed that they had been gone for close to 45 minutes. But to Jim and John, it felt as if only a couple of minutes had passed. According to records, the American military contacted the British authorities at about 4 a.m. Local police were also summoned to the location, but the only lights anyone could see by then were the ones coming from the Orford Nest Lighthouse a few miles away. After Jim Penniston's shift ended, he went home and tried to get some sleep, but the things he witnessed that night, and more importantly, that series of numbers the craft apparently downloaded into his brain, made sleep impossible. As the day went on, all those ones and zeros kept buzzing through his head. It was all he could think about. He couldn't focus on anything else other than that repeating pattern. He finally grabbed his notebook and began jotting down the ones and zeros. As he did, he felt this strange sense of relief wash over him. As the numbers came out and made their way down onto the page, they left his mind entirely. By the time Jim put down his pencil, he could think clearly again. Jim didn't know what to make of this, and he was certain if he tried to tell anyone, they'd just think he was crazy. So he tucked his notebook away and tried to forget about it. Meanwhile, back at Bentwater's base, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt arrived for duty. He was the person in charge of security personnel at Woodbridge, and as soon as he got into the office that day, everyone was buzzing about the men who encountered a UFO the night before. Halt thought this was nonsense, but just to do his due diligence, he told the men to jot it down in the daily shift logs they called the blotters. But the more Halt heard about this incident, the more he realized this wasn't just a few of his security personnel seeing some strange lights in the sky. Just before dawn, he sent some men out to the scene to take some measurements and photographs. Jim Penniston even returned to the site and made a mold of the indentations in the earth using plaster of Paris. Later that day, Lieutenant Colonel Halt thought he should take a closer look at the shift blotters. But when he went looking for them, the blotters were gone. No one could explain where they went either. Halt tried to shrug the whole thing off. Later that night, the base was having its annual awards dinner. Halt was in attendance hanging out with some of the other colonels when one of his shift commanders burst into the party and rushed over towards him. The man's face was pale, and he looked nervous. He pulled Halt away from his conversation and whispered to him that the UFO was back. Halt decided that he needed to check this out for himself, so he quickly put together a small team of officers to come with him, including Sergeant Monroe Nevels from the Air Force's Disaster Preparedness Office. Nevels brought along a Geiger counter to see if the object was giving off any radiation. The men were really prepared this time for anything they might have encountered. They brought flashlights, radios, extra batteries, and a tape recorder, which Halt used to document the entire night. At first, the men didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but they still decided they should inspect the area around where Jim Penniston and John Burroughs said they encountered something unusual. They went to the spot where Penniston said he saw the craft. There were still a number of broken branches everywhere, as well as the 3 indentations in the earth. Sergeant Nevels took a Geiger counter reading of the area, and the device showed elevated levels of radiation in the area. This was unusual in itself because planes don't give off radiation, but things only grew stranger from there. There was a small farm on the outskirts of the forest, and Halt and the other officers could hear the animals going crazy, making lots of noise. It was as if something was causing them great distress that night. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Halt and the others spotted a tiny red light in the sky about a half-mile away. You can hear from the tone in Halt's voice on his recordings that he was clearly nervous.
Watch. Made the head off my flashlight there, sir. There it is.
Hey, I see it too. What is it?
We don't know, sir.
So can I get some of it? Yeah, it's a strange, small red light. Looks to be out maybe a quarter to half mile, maybe further out. I'm going to switch off it. The light is gone now. It was approximately 120 degrees from the site. Is it back again?
Yes, sir.
Oh, douse the flashlight, then. Let's move out to the edge of the clearing so we can get a better look at it. See if you can get the star scope on it. The light's still there, and all the barnyard animals have gotten quiet now. Everything else is just deathly calm. There's no doubt about it. There's some type of strange flashing red light ahead.
There's yellow.
I saw a yellow tinge in it, too.
He said at one point that the Geiger counter's readings were going up, meaning that whatever it was they were seeing, it was emitting radiation. The light kept coming closer until it got to about 200 yards away. Halt described it as like looking at the pupil of an eye. He also said it appeared as if it were opening and closing, sort of like it was winking at him. The light kept darting erratically around the sky, and it wasn't alone. Soon it was joined by another craft shaped like a crescent moon. It was also at that point when it appeared that the craft took notice of the team, because one of the UFOs shot a thin beam of light that looked sort of like a laser towards the ground about 10 feet away from Halt and the other officers. The beam didn't do any damage, though. Instead, it appeared to be scanning for something. Halt was convinced that whatever this thing was, it must be under intelligent control. Not only was the craft able to guide its way through the trees, but when Halt and his men tried to approach the craft, it backed away from them. The craft zipped over the 2 bases until it came to the weapons storage area. It was then that the craft began shining the beam of light down onto the facility for several minutes before it shot off into the sky. Now, this isn't official, but according to author Nick Pope, who used to work in the UK's Ministry of Defense, it was rumored that the bases might actually have been protecting a secret nuclear arsenal. Throughout the past several decades, there have been a number of alleged incidents where UFOs have been sighted buzzing around U.S. nuclear facilities. If this is true, then that might explain why the Air Force Office of Special Investigations might have decided to get involved in the case. During the last week of December, Jim Penniston and John Burroughs said that the Air Force OSI questioned them several times about what they encountered in Rendlesham Forest. But according to Jim, the OSI agents seemed less interested in hearing what happened and more interested in covering things up. Jim said he turned in a 4-page statement about his experiences to an agent. 20 minutes later, the agent came back and handed Jim back a revised version of the statement he'd written. Most of the details had been stripped out, and Jim's testimony had been reduced to a single paragraph. What's left was a brief statement saying he saw a generic aircraft. The agent told Jim he was to memorize this statement because it would be his official story going forward. Many of the witnesses stationed at the twin bases were told that the case was classified as top secret. They were forbidden from speaking about it to anyone, not even the other officers who were there. Despite the number of officers who claimed to have seen strange lights that night, only 3 other officers besides Jim and John were questioned by investigators. Some stories even claim the men were administered truth serums and were even hypnotized to manipulate their memories. But after several days of questioning, the OSI investigators just packed up and left. After that, no one, not Jim Penniston, Lieutenant Colonel Halt, nor anyone else, heard another peep about the investigation. In January 1981, Halt decided to take matters into his own hands by drafting a letter to the UK's Ministry of Defence, informing them about the situation. Halt watered down the story a little so that he didn't sound too crazy. But he did still mention some of the evidence, like the radiation detected and the indentations in the ground. One problem, though, was Halt wrote down the wrong date, saying the sightings occurred on December 27th, not the 26th. So, of course, when the MOD looked into the radar reports for that date, they said they saw nothing out of the ordinary. But if the Ministry of Defense had simply looked at the reports from the previous day, the 26th, they would have seen that several radar stations in the vicinity recorded unidentified objects in the airspace. They would have also been able to confirm several Suffolk County police reports of witnesses seeing strange lights in the sky. At the same time, this seems like a pretty simple mistake to overlook and figure out what happened. That is, if the Ministry of Defense had only dug a little deeper. But the Ministry of Defense simply brushed the case under the rug and decided not to investigate any further. It seemed like pretty much everyone just chose to forget about the incident after that. Well, almost everyone. Jim Penniston and John Burroughs couldn't forget. They both left the Air Force, but they couldn't leave their past behind, because in the years that followed, they continued to suffer from a variety of health problems. Specifically, both men began suffering from symptoms that were associated with radiation exposure. In 2011, the mitral valve to John's heart failed. Since this was normally something that would happen in much older patients, doctors wanted to know if John had anything in his medical history that could account for this. Something like, for example, a massive dose of radiation. After that, John tried to contact the Air Force to get his medical records, and he couldn't believe the response he got. The Air Force denied that John was ever employed by them in 1980. John argued back that he had lots of proof that he was. Eventually, the Air Force changed their tune. They then came back and admitted to John that, yes, he was indeed in the Air Force when he said he was, but no, he couldn't have his medical records because they were classified. It took several lawyers and a number of go-arounds before John was finally able to get hold of his medical records, just not all of them. Some of them remain classified to this day. During all this back and forth, John learned that the UK's Ministry of Defence did do some investigating after all, and they discovered radiation out in Rendlesham Forest. John wasn't the only one having health issues either. Jim Penniston also experienced a number of symptoms after leaving the Air Force. His eyes began to fail, and he had constant throat issues. Years later, he was diagnosed with the inner ear disorder called Meniere's disease. This is something that causes the person suffering it to have dizzy spells and vertigo. This is also something that doctors say can be triggered by exposure to high levels of radiation. Jim also said he continues to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, but the Air Force refused to pay for his treatment. For many years after his encounter, Jim had trouble sleeping. He eventually went to see a hypnotherapist for help. The use of hypnotherapy is controversial to say the least. Hypnotherapy has been used in other UFO cases to help people recover repressed memories. But many skeptics of the practice say that all hypnotherapy does is open the subject up to suggestion and actually allows for the creation of new, false memories of things that didn't really occur. During Jim's hypnotherapy appointments, he discovered that certain parts of his memory had gaps in it. There were parts of his encounter in the forest that were just blank. Eventually, though, Jim had a breakthrough. That's when he recalled that the Air Force OSI had administered sodium pentothal, aka truth serum. According to Jim, while he was under the influence of the drugs, he apparently told the 2 government agents that the craft had stopped in the woods to repair itself. When he reached out and touched the craft, he accidentally disrupted the repair process, and that's when he activated some new program that downloaded information directly into his brain. That's also when Jim came to another revelation. He said that the visitors inside the craft weren't extraterrestrials. They were us. According to Jim Penniston, the occupants of the craft that landed in Rendlesham Forest weren't ETs. Rather, they were human time travelers from the distant future. Jim also said that the government agents didn't seem particularly surprised by any of this. They never asked him any details about the craft or the code they supposedly beamed into his brain. All they wanted to know is if Jim ever had any other encounters with these time travelers before. Jim said he hadn't. The agents then briefly discussed their next steps with one another. They weren't sure what to do with Jim to keep him from telling anyone about time travelers. Evidently, they decided to use some sort of hypnotic suggestion to prevent Jim from recalling what he knew about the visitors from the future. I know, this story is pretty wild, and considering how controversial the science is behind hypnotherapy, it would be easy to believe that Jim's imagination made up many of these details under hypnosis. But you also have to remember one thing. Jim had physical evidence that he was telling the truth. Remember Jim's notebook? Well, he didn't, not at first. In October 2010, Jim was filming a segment for the TV series Ancient Aliens when he showed the producers his notebook with the drawings of the craft and strange hieroglyphics. That was when the producer noticed all the ones and zeros Jim jotted down in the book and asked what they were. Jim said rather nonchalantly that they were the numbers the craft beamed into his head. The producer thought that they looked like binary code, the sort of code that's used by computers everywhere. So the producer sent copies of the code to some computer experts without telling them where the code originated from. The computer experts were able to decipher the code into a message from the future. It read,
Exploration of Humanity 6668100. Continuous for planetary advance. Eyes of your eyes, origin year 8100.
The message also contained what turned out to be latitude and longitude coordinates of several significant locations around the world. This included Sedona, Arizona, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Nazca Lines of Peru, Mount Taishan in China, and the Temple of Apollo in Greece. It also marked a spot out in the Atlantic Ocean just labeled Origin. This was supposedly the location of a mythical island called High Brazil. This is a legendary phantom island in the ocean from Irish folklore that appeared on some ancient maps from many centuries ago. But when you search for the location today, there's no island there. I know, this is all a lot to take in. And you really have to wonder how much we should believe. Jim Penniston, John Burroughs, Colonel Halt, and the other witnesses were all seasoned Air Force officers. These are all what you would typically think of as credible witnesses. At the same time, over the years, skeptics have poked holes in their stories and come up with some more down-to-earth explanations of what the men really encountered out in the woods. One of the most common explanations you'll hear is that what all the men saw were the lights from the Orfordness Lighthouse a few miles away. The lighthouse is visible from the eastern side of Rendlesham Forest, the precise direction all the men would have been looking when they spotted the strange lights. There have even been some skeptics who managed to line up the movements of the lighthouse's oscillating light with Lieutenant Colonel Halt's audio recording where he keeps seeing the light flashing on and off. It's also true that Burroughs and Cabansag's official statements say that what they witnessed was nothing more than the lighthouse. But Burroughs claims he was forced to sign that statement. Cabansag, on the other hand, has stuck to his story that all he saw that night was the lighthouse. Although some reports you'll see claim that everyone knew the lighthouse was there, so none of the other officers would have been fooled by it. Cabansag claims otherwise, though. He said that not many Americans on the base knew about the lighthouse's existence, so it stands to reason that they might mistake the light for a UFO. Jim Penniston is the only member of the group who claims to have actually physically touched the craft, but his story has also changed over the years. Because in other accounts he said that when he approached the craft, it flew back away from him. He's also the only one to report experiencing missing time. And that only appeared in his accounts after he went through hypnotic regression in 1994. It was only after Penniston went through hypnosis that he recalled actually touching the craft. Even though Lieutenant Colonel Halt claimed to have recorded everything that occurred the entire night, nearly 5 hours of tape recordings, he has only ever released about 18 minutes of audio. He has since refused to release anything else. Some people have questioned Jim Penniston's notebook too, saying that the man wasn't even on the scene long enough to have filled it up as much as he did. Some locals have said that the broken tree branches everyone identified were cut down by people with hatchets to clear the brush, and that the indentations in the earth weren't all that deep and were likely caused by animals. But as mundane as all those explanations are, there's yet another theory that's been put out there as to what really happened in Rendlesham Forest that night. And that's the one where the Americans were the victim of a prank that got out of hand. In 2018, several members of the SAS British Special Forces came forward saying that the whole thing had been a practical joke on their part. They said that in 1980 they decided to test the base's security by parachuting in, only they got caught. But because this was a nuclear base, the Americans weren't very kind to the SAS. They roughed them up and interrogated them for 18 hours to make sure they weren't secret Soviet agents. But the SAS didn't forget, so they decided to get their revenge. According to some reports, the SAS got hold of a couple of black helium balloons, some remote-controlled kites, and some flares, and decided to have a little fun by flying them over the base. Now, one problem you'll find with this story, though, is that in every account I could find, none of these SAS officers involved ever give their names. It's always just reported as some former SAS men. But a prank gone wrong still doesn't explain a lot of the other parts of the story, such as Jim Peniston's notebook. Peniston had been talking about his experiences in UFO documentaries since the early 2000s. But he never mentions the binary code at the back of the book until 2010, which feels a little strange to me. You also have to wonder why aliens would choose to communicate in English. Well, you could argue that these weren't actually true extraterrestrials, but rather our future descendants from the year 8100, so of course they would use one of our Earth languages. But although the translation is often reported the way I described it here, there are some stories you can find which say the translation was nowhere near as coherent as all the UFO documentaries make it sound, and that the TV producers had to tweak it to make it sound more coherent. Oh, and apparently the coordinates weren't actually part of the initial message either, but they were added later to spice things up. So does all this mean that none of the men actually encountered aliens or anything else out of the ordinary that night? Maybe. We don't really know. One other theory that's been put forth is that perhaps these well-meaning soldiers were all duped into believing a counterintelligence operation. One of the most frustrating parts of UFO research is the knowledge that the U.S. government is admitted to actually feeding disinformation to UFO researchers to make them all look like kooks. I've talked in the past about counterintelligence officers like Air Force OSI agent Richard Doty, who once gaslit a man named Paul Benowitz into believing an alien invasion was imminent. In just the past few years, we've had a rash of alleged government whistleblowers, like David Grush and Luis Elizondo, coming forward claiming the United States government is covering up what it knows about UFOs, or UAPs as they're now called. But because of the number of cases where men like Richard Doty have been revealed to have been feeding disinformation and crazy rumors to the media and to legitimate UFO researchers, it's difficult to know what to believe, and that's the whole point. Sow just enough chaos into the mix so you don't know what's real and what's not. Then if any real information does get out, it all just gets swept away once the lies are revealed. We'll likely never know for certain what, if anything, really happened in Rendlesham Forest. Because all of the truth may be out there, it's long since been shrouded in so many half-truths and lies, you can't see the forest for the trees. So what do you think happened at Rendlesham Forest? Leave me a comment below because I'd love to hear your thoughts. And while you're at it, click on the video on the screen to see even more weird and mysterious content.